What I do, as I was saying earlier, I work with immigrants, both refugees and undocumented immigrants, or documented, as the case may be. But I also work mostly, this is the truth, I work mostly with teachers. I do training and workshops for teachers who work with immigrants, particularly in the ESL classroom. And over the last year, I have also worked with churches, with libraries, and with healthcare workers. One of the things that I'm focusing on is on building community and a sense of empathy through storytelling, specifically immigrant storytelling. So I like to start by talking about the promise of this country. And you are all familiar with this promise: give me your tired, your poor. This is the promise of a welcoming land, somebody who is going to lift the lamp beside the golden door and who will welcome everybody in. Unfortunately, the reality that people are seeing today is this one: give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, as long as they meet our labor needs and don't overstay their welcome. And you see the bottom of the statue says, Statue of Incremental Immigration Reform. I like to use cartoons and caricatures like this one because they, in very few words, reflect the mood of the country. This is the reality. So how do we talk to students when we are facing this particular reality? What is it that we need to do? Considering three things in the classroom. We need to consider the culture in our community and this particular political climate, the cultural identity of our students, and finally, considering your own identity vis-a-vis the narrative in our country and the stories of our students. Just last week, Steve Miller, the advisor to the president, said that the poem, Emma Lazarus Colossus' poem, does not belong in the Statue of Liberty, and that actually does not reflect our values today. I would like to disagree with him. So the fear that our students feel is very true, is a real feeling of fear for the future, for themselves, for their families. How do we let them talk about who they are, and how do we start building community, a community that addresses that fear, a community that builds empathy based on common themes? When I work with teachers, one of the things that I do is we have this question, the question of how do we work? What is it that we need to do? Earlier we heard the question of what can teachers and administrators in the schools do. We need to be aware of the student's situation, the student's story. Many times we have the students, we think we know what their stories are, but we don't really know. And I will give you an example. Last year, I was teaching ESL, and it was a communication class to a group of immigrants, refugees. These people were refugees. I knew that they were refugees. I knew that most of them came from the Middle East. So I thought, and I have been working with the topic of immigrants and immigration and ESL for 30 years, so I should have known better, but I didn't. So I thought I knew the stories that they would be telling, and yet I had a student who was very reticent to share her story. She ultimately, when she finally talked to me, her story was a story of devastating violence against herself, against her family. We don't really know the story until we open up and let them tell the story, even if it affects our pre-planned lesson plan or our curriculum. So let's start by talking about ourselves. we need to do teacher professional development. And the question was asked, what is it that we do in the classroom? Well, we are going to do three things. Today, I'm going to focus on immigrant stories and identity, how the stories of immigration affect what we do in the classroom. But as we talked earlier, we need to also do professional development around the topic of immigrant or immigration myths and realities, and the history of immigration in this country. I'm not going to be able to focus, because of lack of time, on the myths and realities or in the immigration history. I will focus on our student stories. So let's look at your own stories. If we are going to talk about the immigration stories of our students, we need to start by looking at our own story, being able and willing to share our own personal story. Of course, sharing the personal story of the teacher in front of the students requires a certain level of personal disclosure. They will learn about you and who you are, and that, as teachers, sometimes makes us uncomfortable because it reflects some vulnerability. And yet, it is important that they see that your story and their story, although different, may have some common themes. So when we tell stories of teachers, and I have teachers tell the stories at the beginning of my workshops, we then can build, identify common themes and build on those common themes. The identifying of common themes is very important because it leads to that sense of empathy, of commonality, of community. Our stories have common ideas, common experiences, similar experiences. So let's start by telling immigrant stories. We are going to go to the Padlet, and most of you, or many of you anyhow, did the homework that I asked you to do, which was to tell your immigrant story in 2 or 3 paragraphs. Now I'm going to ask you to take no more than 5 minutes at most to read 2 or 3 of those stories. I saw many comments, some of them very, very interesting. One of them I was just reading says something to the effect that many of you know a little bit about your story of immigration and yet do not reflect much empathy for what your ancestors went through in coming to this country or adapting to this country or fitting in. And that is an interesting comment to make. Absolutely, the closer you are to the generation that immigrated, the more likely you are to understand and have empathy. But that is precisely one of the reasons why I think that it's valuable for us as teachers. And when I say teachers, I could be saying librarians or healthcare workers or pastors that I have been working with. That is precisely why we need to start telling these stories, bringing them out, learning more about our own story, because it allows us to see the common themes of the stories of our students. So when I was reading your stories, I saw some of these common themes. Food shortages were common. Many of your ancestors came here with limited education. They had to move around. Some had to depend on food banks and public housing, and they were thankful because of that and the ability to use services that this country offers. A number of you had stories of your ancestors going to school without knowing English. The sacrifice entailed both in the process of immigrating and also in the process of creating a new future for your family. The opportunities and the hard work, career changes that many immigrants have to go through. Immigrants that were that maybe one profession in the native country, and then they had to change because they didn't know the language or they didn't have the same opportunities and had to start all over again. Abandoning traditions from the past, that is another common theme that I saw in your stories, and at the same time making up new traditions that you bring to this country have been left behind but you're starting to develop new traditions and adapting new traditions. Some of you, particular story was very powerful. Somebody said that she wishes you would have listened to stories of your ancestors. And I would recommend to all of you, if you have the opportunity, sit down with your parents, grandparents, the elders in your family, and start recording those stories. It is very powerful. And so your ancestors came from many different countries to find a different life. Many of them were farmers, and many mentioned the fact that immigration was a difficult process, both in the past and now in the present, and acknowledging that today it is a lot more difficult than it was 100 years ago, significantly more difficult for people going through the process now. So these are the stories that you told. You are the teachers. Maybe you have never been asked to think about your story of immigration. One of you told the story of not being immigrants because your family is African American and your ancestors were brought here by force to be slaves. And that creates a new story, completely different story. Your family did not immigrate, at least not willingly. They form a completely different narrative. And yet, when you look at the slave narrative, particularly after slaves were freed after the Civil War, when you look at the narrative of former slaves trying to fit in the new communities, and you look at the stories of some immigrants starting from zero, particularly in moments of our history where immigration was looked at with fear or with hate, I see many of the same ideas. A story of resiliency, a story of hard times, a story of very hard work. That is common. So even though sometimes we have a history of immigrating to this country for whatever reasons versus a history of being forced to come to this country to be a slave, the stories, when you analyze them, have some common threads that can help us build on those common topics and build empathy, develop empathy. So the part of the professional development is to identify the themes. You did a brief work of identifying the themes. If I had you with me for 6 hours, as I do often with teachers, then we would carefully look at these themes and what are the common experiences that your family and families in the past have had. We can take this same exercise and then tell the story of our family immigration and compare it to the stories of our students' immigration and see where we can build common ground with our students. So one of the reasons why I tell stories or ask my participants to tell stories of immigration is because the stories that we tell are reflected in our identity. The stories that we tell are, in a way, have shaped our identity. I'm sharing with you something called the Identity Mosaic that comes from a resource that I share with you, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, the second edition. There are 4 now, I believe, but the one that I use is the second edition. And these researchers talk about identity as a composite of many, many different variables, as you see: ethnicity, sexual identity, race, religion, sex, and so forth. The question to ask is, if you look at the identity as a pie, what part of your identity is immigrant? Is your immigration story part of your identity? Some of you say that you don't really know much about your ancestry, but do you identify as a German family? Do you identify as a poor family from Southern Europe? Is any story of that immigration saga part of your current identity. If it is true that your identity has been shaped by immigration, does that place you at a targeted or an advantaged position? For example, if you're an immigrant from Germany, or from other parts, from Scandinavia, for example. My wife, for example, is German and Swedish. Typical immigrant story. That places her in an advantage situation because my wife is white. Many of you said, I am white, I am European. That typically places you in an advantage situation. If you are an immigrant from Syria or from Mexico or other countries that the president has called with a very nasty name, that identity as an immigrant is placing you today in a targeted position. That is, your identity is the target of hatred, the target of discrimination, the target of a very negative story. So how does that affect you? Are you the person who you used to be? Can you be the person that you used to be? Do you see yourself different today than you did when you were in your country? Oftentimes when talking about my own story, I immigrated twice. I immigrated to this country, but when I immigrated to this country, I did that not only willingly, very happily, to get married to an American citizen that I had been dating for a number of years. But so when I tell my story, when I started working with stories of immigrants, I never thought that my story was relevant at all because I felt I was terribly privileged to have come to this country the way I did. And yet later I remember that I was also an immigrant before when I had to leave Argentina, where I was born and raised, because of the military dictatorship, and we were forced to leave the country with very little and start all over in Spain. I tell the story now because what I discovered is that my identity changed significantly when in Argentina I was the son of a very prominent journalist, a very well-known TV personality, and in Spain I was not anymore. In Spain, I was just an immigrant from South America. My parents were unemployed and so forth. My identity changed. My position in the new community, in the new society, changed completely. So we need to look at how is the student identity, your own, if you're working at the level of your story, how is your identity affected by your story? But now let's consider the stories of our students. Let's consider the student in light of the of the identity mosaic that I showed you. What component of the social identity of your student makes them targets of immigration, of discrimination because they are immigrants? Are there ways in which your students are today being discriminated? Are they being disadvantaged? Are your students immigrants from Mexico or Central America? How does the political and social climate today affect their ability to identify proudly with Mexico, identify proudly with Central America, if the president is saying that all Mexicans are rapists, or you see that reflected in the current narrative? Are your students Muslim? How does that affect their identity? We heard earlier that some students don't want to, some parents didn't want to even be identified as speaking Spanish because of fear of being targeted for discrimination if they find out that they are Hispanic. Are they refugees from Central Africa or from Northern Africa? They have a whole host of issues that are very traumatic. So we need to look at our identity, our students' identity, and make a determination. Yes, I'm working with advantaged students. They came in an advantaged situation. They're international students getting a college degree. Or I'm working with disadvantaged students, students who today are targeted for discrimination, targeted for hatred, and perhaps in fear for their future, in fear for the future of their families. So how do we get to know those stories? How do we get to understand the stories? We need to ask the students to tell them, to share the stories with us. So culturally determined perceptions and expectations in this country of our students are very important, and we need to understand where they fit in the narrative that is being spoken today in this country. If you're familiar with the idea of master narrative, we have a master narrative about immigration today, which is very negative. We need to determine who owns it. How do we serve that master story or master narrative of immigration? That is, as long as we continue ignoring it, not knowing our own story, not knowing stories of immigration in this country or the history of the system, we cannot change it. So how do we change the narrative? And most importantly, how do our students fit in this master narrative? Are they part of the master narrative? That is why we want to have them tell the stories. I hope that you're familiar with Jose Antonio Vargas, and this is taking me now into the classroom, what we will do and can do in the classroom. Jose Antonio Vargas wrote recently, and I have a resource to share with you, a book published last year called Dear American Notes of an Undocumented Citizen. And in that book, he tells the story of coming to this country not knowing that he was undocumented. I noticed in the chat room, Patricia Elfers said that she had a student who didn't know he was undocumented. Well, Jose Antonio Vargas didn't know that he was undocumented, from the Philippines, and tells a very powerful story of not fitting in, of having to learn about America. He calls learning America one of his school subjects. But then he realized that he could write himself into America, and I use this a lot now in my workshops since I read his book last year, because I'm teaching teachers how to write the histories of immigration with their students. So he talks about how writing his story and starting to write stories about himself allowed him to write himself into the master narrative, into America. How do we help our students write themselves into the master narrative? How do these stories, their stories, fit in our curriculum? So we will start the way that you started. I would start with the students. Tell your story. Your story of immigration, your life in the country, a story about your childhood. Listen to the students telling the stories. So they share. I told you earlier for the homework to write your story in 2 or 3 paragraphs. If you have an advanced class, they can write a longer story. If you have a lower level language class, you can write very short, brief stories of 1 or 2 paragraphs. Listen to the stories and then have people in groups to identify common themes. And again, just as we did with the teachers, have the students identify those common themes, and because common themes allow us to develop community and empathy. Once they tell the story is put in writing. If you're familiar, there is a book that I recommend you read, and if you haven't read it, read it, called Other People's Words, The Cycle of Low Literacy by Victoria Purcell Gates. This book is a fantastic way of getting people to tell their own stories. And very shortly, very briefly, I will tell you, the story of this woman is a woman who is completely illiterate and who learned to read and write once she told her own story. And she says at one point, now I understand because these are my own words. Until now, the school had me write other people's words. And she cannot read because she cannot understand other people's words. Once she tells her own story, she starts realizing that English, the language, the written language, reflects her own story and now makes sense. So just as we did, once we told the stories, we can help them write the stories. And I'm using one of yours from the Padlet. And it's a very brief, as you see, just two very brief paragraphs. My parents are immigrants from Mexico. They left Mexico in their late 20s. My father got work opportunities. The students can write this. It's not very difficult. And then once they are written, they can start working in teams, in groups, and identify those common themes and say, yeah, my parents also left their country when they were young. Oh, they also had to work in California, or they worked in the fields, and the United States offered resources. Did your family also have to use low-income family resources, and so forth? You started building that commonality that is important to create community in the classroom. I believe that once you start developing this commonality, the students will be able to deal with personal trauma a lot better. You can do reading, and here I have a resource called the Change Agent that has stories written by students. Every single item in the Change Agent is written by students. So you can do in the classroom activities pre-reading another story. I'm showing you another story of somebody crossing the border. You do pre-reading and reading. I do reading in cycles, and then an open discussion after as a post-reading activity. Once again, the open discussion being, what are the common themes? Did your experience have anything in common with his experience or with her experience? I guess I've gone very quickly, but we don't have any more time. So these are some of the resources that I'm sharing with you. First, the books that I mentioned, and then two websites to look at. One is Define American. Define American is a website by Jose Antonio Vargas, the author of that book, Undocumented, and Dear America. And you will find many, many resources in Define America if you are working with undocumented immigrants. And the Change Agent is a magazine that I'm telling you is written by students in adult education classrooms. It's written at a generally very low level. So if you have low-level language students, you can work with the Change Agent. And I know that I'm out of time, so thank you very much.